Hello everyone, and welcome to our online combined Sunday school classes, the Agape class and the Young Men's Bible class, two of our larger Sunday school classes here at First Presbyterian Church on North Elm Street at Fisher Park near downtown Greensboro. I'm Lane Ridenhour, and I lead the hymn singing for the Young Men's Bible class, and I welcome you and thank you for joining us as we gather together here for worship and study on this, the 22nd Sunday after Pentecost, Sunday, October 24th. Today at First Presbyterian Church, the Reverend Jill Duffield will continue her sermon series on the fruit of the Spirit. Today she'll be speaking on goodness at both the 9 a.m. Rejoice service and the 11 a.m. traditional service. You're welcome to attend either service here in person at the church, but of course you're also welcome to join us on our live stream for the 11 o'clock traditional service. Just go to our church website, www.fpcgreensboro.org. That's www.fpcgreensboro.org. And there you'll find the link for the live stream service as well as a link to our Sunday bulletin. We take note that the Young Men's Bible class celebrated a birthday yesterday. It was first organized October 23rd, 1929, just a few weeks after the church moved into our current location here in Fisher Park. So happy 92nd birthday to the Young Men's Bible class. Our Sunday school teacher, Professor Sandie Gravett, is continuing her series today on the book of 2 Corinthians, Paul's letter to the church in Corinth. Today she'll be speaking about becoming the righteousness of God. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21, it says, God made him who had no sin to be the sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Sandy will expound on that in just a few moments. But first, let's sing a hymn together. Take time to be holy. It's based on a text from Peter chapter 1, verse 16. Be ye holy, for I am holy. Take time to be holy, which reflects the understanding that holiness, like every virtue, requires time and attention to develop. The hymn might not be so well known as some of the others that we sing here. The original words were not written by a minister or a songwriter, but by an English businessman by the name of William Longstaff. He was also a Christian layman who took his faith seriously. His poem was set to music in 1882 by the well-known gospel hymn writer George Stebbins. I'll put the words up on the screen for you and invite you to sing along with me. Take time to be holy.
Take time to be holy, speak oft with thy Lord, abide in him always, and feed on his word. Make friends of God's children, help those who are weak, forgetting in nothing his blessing to seek. Take time to be holy, let him be thy guide, and run not before him, whatever betide. In joy or in sorrow, still follow thy Lord, and looking to Jesus, still trust in his word. Take time to be holy, be calm in thy soul. Each thought and each motive be his control. Thus led by his Spirit to fountains of love, thou soon shalt be fitted for service above.
This week, we come upon one of Paul's key phrases, the righteousness of God. It is a core concept to Paul's teaching. We see it all over Romans, it is in Galatians, it pops up in 1 Corinthians, as well as here in 2 Corinthians. We also get a glimpse of it in Philippians. In brief, Paul's theology is heavily invested in this idea. Not surprisingly then, it has been the subject of no small debate over time. Augustine, Luther, and Calvin, among many others, take a shot at explaining exactly what Paul meant when he uttered these words. I even talked about this phrase when we studied the book of Romans last fall. While I don't want to repeat that work today, I also don't want to let the phrase simply slip by here. Rather, I want to set these words into our current context and understand why Paul is pushing that idea in this letter. By this point in our study of 2 Corinthians, it's not going to be shocking to you to hear that Paul is still trying to make clear his own position and that of his team in chapter 5. For me, this continued theme is evidence of the dramatic, profound, and somewhat lasting breach between Paul's group and this community. In other words, the hurt that kept Paul away is nothing simple or easily resolved. It is not too much to say for contemporary readers trying to get a hold of the idea that this community was polarized. Now that's a word that we understand all too well in our day and time. It means that people are dug in, and movement to repair the breach is proving difficult. Paul recognizes that he is a figure that has generated no small amount of dissension among the people of Corinth. In many ways, the ongoing nature of the issues is because Paul is not a halfway kind of individual. He draws intentionally sharp contrast between his people and all the others who are out there in the marketplace of ideas. He further expects that his ideas are going to be the ones that take the day. Thus he says, "We are not commending ourselves to you again, but giving you an opportunity to boast about us, so that you may be able to answer those who boast in outward appearance and not in the heart." He is telling the folks in Corinth that there are choices to be made, and he expects them to side with him, and to do so loudly and clearly. Read the subtext. There is not any room for compromise. It makes most of us, if we are honest, a bit tense. Communities, after all, are typically built on accommodation and compromise. And we realize that the ability to compromise is important, even as we acknowledge that people are prone to seeking out others who see the world much as they do. What am I trying to say? I'd start by holding the position that people like Paul can be difficult to swallow in normal circumstances. All of us have experience with folks who are dogged to the point that they are willing to tear up families, friendships, and yes, even churches. But when things are already fraught and those folks are holding firm in their positions, especially when they are cloaking their positions in the mantle of God. Well, good luck with doing anything constructive in those circumstances. I cannot change this facet of Paul's character or how he comes across to us in many of his texts. Here in this passage, however, there is something about what is motivating Paul. Actually, it's a pretty simple concept. For him, Christ crucified and risen changes everything. In fact, Paul sees this world and the cosmos as completely recalibrated in these events. As we saw last week, it was not that Jesus' life and way of being in the world was unimportant to Paul. Paul makes it pretty clear that the way Jesus lived was an aspirational model of service for him and for those in his circle. But it was Paul's encounter with the resurrected Lord that was decisive for him, and it was decisive because Christ's crucifixion and resurrection didn't simply tilt Paul's personal world on its axis. For Paul, these things transformed the reality in which all exist, because they provide a new basis on which we are to relate to and to understand God. I want to repeat that in different words. For Paul, this whole enterprise of God is not about personal salvation. It is, rather, about everything we know being transformed. It is about God working in relationship to all of creation, not simply little old us. Watch how Paul talks about what that shift means for him and his team and why they are doing what they do. He says, "For the love of Christ compels us, because we are convinced that one has died for all. Therefore, all have died. And he died for all, so that those who live might live no longer for themselves, but for him who died and was raised for them." Check out this language. Compels comes first. It is the Greek verb suneko, which means to be seized, held together, pressed in on every side. Paul is saying he has been gripped by this love of Christ, demonstrated by Christ's service to all and culminating in his death on the cross. And there is no exit for Paul from that grip. Still, he counterbalances that passion with the verb krino, which means judging or determining or distinguishing what has happened in a legal setting. And that something that Paul has determined is that Christ died for all humanity. What compels him, however, is not simply that fact. Paul has also concluded that all of us have died as well. Now clearly, he is still living and breathing, as are the recipients of his letter. The point is not that everybody dropped dead. Rather, he is saying that if Jesus Christ, the incarnate Son of the living and eternal God, goes to his death on a cross, it means that death is, in fact, the fate of all of us in this mortal world. Christ's death, to Paul's mind, however, is different, as the next phrase tells us. Christ does not stay dead. Christ was raised. For Paul, when God raises Christ, the fact of death itself is defeated, and the eternity of God opens up. As a result, those among the living have also already been given the possibility of doing something in the here and now that embraces the eternity of God. We can live for Christ, who died and was raised for us. But the question is, how? Watch Paul's next move. From now on, therefore, we regard no one from a human point of view. Even though we once knew Christ from that human point of view, we no longer know him in that way. So if anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. Everything old has passed away. See, everything has become new. Paul is telling us that we as Christians, we who understand God's work in this way, can no longer see the world as we saw it through human eyes. Something new is present, and we have to not only see it, but to live in it. To give you an analogy, it is for Paul as if he is watching the Christ story in 3D, HD, color on a massive screen, and everybody else is seeing a fuzzy black and white 2D picture on a flimsy portable TV. Paul is not, however, content simply to celebrate his good fortune, his insight. Rather, he is urgent about helping everyone else to see what it is that he sees. And what exactly is it? Well, for him, there is no more longing for a future where God is going to eventually live among us. Eternity, he now knows, not only exists, it is present here among us. It was here when Jesus was living on this earth, and it is here now in the presence of the risen Lord that Paul encountered. It's a tough teaching because we live in a world marked by time. But for Paul, we are not to envision ourselves in a slow decline from life into death. Rather, we are to see ourselves as created anew, given entree into a present, growing, and expanding eternity. How are we a part of such a thing? Paul goes on. All of this is from God, Paul says, who reconciled us to God's self through Christ and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, God was in Christ reconciling the world to God's self, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting the message of reconciliation to us. So we are ambassadors for Christ. Since God is making God's appeal through us, we entreat you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. The verb katalasso here is interesting. Paul says without hesitation that reconciliation is God's work because it is God who has been wronged. And it is only the one who has been wronged that can enact forgiveness and thus ideally make possible reconciliation, restoration of a relationship that has been damaged. Once, however, we have been reconciled to God, we are also to do likewise. That is, we are to be about reconciliation. To help us get our heads around what he's talking about, I want to tell you a story. It's about theologian Jürgen Moltmann, who is still alive today at 95 years old. In 1944, when he was only 18, Moltmann was called up into the German army and stationed near the front lines. By February 1945, he had come upon circumstances which required him to surrender to a British soldier. He became a prisoner of war and remained as such for about 3 years, first in Belgium and then in Scotland. He lived in a hard labor camp, which was physically taxing even on a young man. But it was also emotionally wrenching. Guards would do things like nail photographs of concentration camps to the prisoners' huts, forcing them to confront the horrors of the Holocaust. Moltmann says that he was lost and sometimes wished he had died like many of his compatriots. Everything he had held on to in his life was torn from him. Now, he was not raised a Christian. Moltmann will also tell you that he started learning about God in that prison, largely from a copy of the New Testament and Psalms given to him by an American chaplain. But it was the summer of 1947 when things really changed. He was part of a small group of imprisoned German soldiers to be invited to a gathering of young Christians from all over the world. The soldiers, he says, naturally were nervous. They were still in uniform. They knew what their country had been a part of. What could they say? How would they be received? Moltmann speaks about how they were welcomed without accusation and without being despised. They shared meals with these young Christians. They prayed and they sang together. And he says that this acceptance made possible something else. It started for him an experience of reconciliation. Specifically, he describes an encounter at this retreat between the soldiers and a group of Dutch students. I'm going to let him tell the story. The Dutch students told us that the bridge on which they had come to meet us was Christ. Without Christ, they would not have exchanged a single word with us and would have had nothing to do with us at all. They told us about the Gestapo terror in their country and about the loss of their Jewish friends killed by the Germans and about the destruction of their families. Let me stop here for a minute. In thinking about this story, Moltmann talks about the difficulty he had with coming to terms with making a sincere apology, and he sees this as a common human condition. He recognizes that none of us is at ease admitting error, and we all too often will, instead of apologizing, offer justifications or try to get others to pity us. He could easily have said to those students, "I was only 18," or "I didn't do any of those things personally," or "I was forced into the army. It wasn't my choice. What would you have had me to do?" He and the other soldiers, however, did not go that way. He continues, "We too could now cross this bridge which Christ had built between them and us, even if only tentatively at first. We could confess the guilt of our people and our own guilt and beg for forgiveness." Notice here that Moltmann does not talk about sin. He talks about guilt. This is not just a feeling of guilty. This is a recognition that one is accountable for the injury inflicted, for the pain caused, for the harm done. I did those things. Only in that moment could those soldiers truly apologize and own up to their part in what happened. Indeed, pulling on ideas from 2 Corinthians 5, Moltmann says it was the forgiveness that they had been shown at the conference that made this moment possible. He writes, I am convinced that the preparedness to forgive the wrong must precede the admission of the wrong, if the outcome is to be an unsparing admission of the wrong committed. He is arguing that when the ones hurt do more than articulate their pain and their loss, but also demonstrate the extension of forgiveness, that something important happens. The guilty are provided a space to acknowledge fully all the ugliness and all the damage that they have brought into being. In brief, he is recognizing that reconciliation always begins with forgiveness. But there is more. Being reconciled is a choice that the guilty must embrace. Moltmann finishes. This reconciliation with the Dutch students, for me, was a liberation. I could breathe again. And I felt once more that I was a human being. We returned to our prisoner of war camps with new courage. I no longer felt forsaken by God and the world, but rather experienced myself as having been accepted and reconciled. In this statement, he is saying that when those young people extended God's love and grace to him, it could not have been easy for them. It was painful that day. He acknowledges that in other places, and it would continue to be difficult for all of them in the years ahead. But what he walked away with was new possibility for his life, a new way of being in the world, because he was shown God, and he took hold of those new directions, that new opportunity, and became a pastor, a teacher, and a world-renowned theologian. But what does all of this have to do with where we started? With the righteousness of God. Well, here we go. Paul says, for our sake God made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Here we are in a covenantal framework. There is a contract between humanity and God. There has been one throughout all history, according to Paul. Both sides, in various ways and in various times, have made commitments to affect this relationship. To Paul's mind, however, it is God that has done the work. It is God who makes possible for us another way, a not death outcome. It is God who opens up the possibility of reconciliation to the eternal by holding out to us forgiveness and by creating for us a new start, a new world. It is God who has extended to us the opportunity to become the righteousness of God, meaning a fit and suitable covenant partner by living into what God has given in Christ. Is it any wonder Paul is awed by what God has accomplished in the crucifixion and resurrection? Is it any wonder Paul struggles against anything or anyone who offers anything less? Paul himself knows what such a transformation feels like, and he wants everyone to share in that feeling, to give their lives in service of a God they may never have imagined, but whose profound love changes everything. It's something to think about this week. Thank you for your time and attention, and I'll look forward to continuing this series next week.